When looking at a finished poem, it's easy to forget what has come before it. The printed page announces itself so crisply and cleanly, it's as though it always has been finished. Then one enters the archive. "How can we see you?" is scrawled in purple pen at the end of the typed lines. A page from the end of section L of the Book of Ephraim. This portion of the poem layers the memory of past lives and deaths with the images of a room and reflections in a mirror. Ephraim himself, the poem unfolds, takes his place in their circle by requesting a mirror propped in a facing chair. Silver-hearted guest. We saw each other in it, he saw us. From this draft, it is clear Merrill sees each word as another, reflected backwards in the capital letters of Ephraim's responses he transcribed on the page. In its unfinished form here, Merrill teases out the ideas and lists of words at the bottom of the page, returns to rewrite lines in red and purple, reflects the word meditate at the bottom of the page backwards as if in a mirror, then underlines tide, shifting the letters, the images, the ideas, the language. In the archive, the poem is not settled, not finished, not finite. It is constantly slipping from word to word, shape to shape, direction to direction, form to form. This is only one of the many, many pages physically housed in the library archive and now digitally housed online in the James Merrill Digital Archive materials for the Book of Ephraim. And one of the striking aspects of the archive is the sheer volume of the materials. As many people have mentioned, it's a treasure trove of many, many pages. And I had ample opportunity to observe that as I scanned each page currently in the archive. Merrill relentlessly revised his work. So the digital archive provides opportunity to participate in the process behind Merrill's finished poem. From the Ouija transcript, where Ephraim takes credit for James's loss of the earliest manuscript pages, which Merrill had drafted in the form of a novel, to the original design of the poem sketched out with sections corresponding to a Ouija board, to the few pages of unlineated verse capturing some of the language that would later launch section A of the finished poem, and finally to the galley proofs still covered in Merrill's penciled-in corrections. I propose to briefly map some of the territory of Merrill's revisions with his unwavering attention to capture a form suitable to his evenings with David Jackson and their familiar spirit. The Book of Ephraim, even its final draft, openly states its own errancy. In the digital archive, Merrill's multicolored, multi-directional lists and rewritten stanzas commemorate a mind constantly striving to transcend the limits of language. The finished poem opens with apologizing for its present state. Admittedly, I err by undertaking this in its present form. As he continues to describe playfully and elliptically at the beginning of the poem, in 1970, Merrill had started planning to write a novel about Ephraim, his spirit contact from his seances. And he began to work on the novel in 1972. He was carrying a manuscript of the first few pages in a bag that was left in a taxi and lost. You're all familiar with the story, as was I when I actually put my hand on this page. It's a typescript of a seance in the Merrill papers. This is an image of the transcription of this Ouija session, where Ephraim is questioned about the event. Ephraim, do you know about the bag I lost with the ibis and manuscript? I did it, Ephraim corrects. And then he goes on to describe the faults of the manuscript he claims to have lost. Merrill's admission of error at the outset of the Book of Ephraim invites his reader into what has been a private conversation between himself, David Jackson, and Ephraim. The opening of the poem mirrors this conversation's continuing concerns with the form, the atmosphere, the fairy tale magic of the encounter, the pressing passage of time, as well as the fear of loss and misrepresentation that ripples throughout the rest of the long poem. at the bottom of the page, it says, fairy tale it will seem, as a piece of news it must be. Time, my dears, is short. Merrill echoes this in the second line of his poem. The baldest prose reportage was called for that would reach the widest public in the shortest time. The absent agent of that sentence, it transpires, who called for the baldest prose reportage, is Ephraim, who guides and inspires the production of the poem. The Ouija conversation with Ephraim revises Merrill's loss of the novel as more than happenstance, and defines the aspirations of Merrill's work as simultaneously urgent and cosmic. Of course, the Ouija sessions do more than provide content, philosophy, and backdrop for the poem. They literally provide its shape. On a draft of some of the later lines from Section A, Merrill sketches his concept for the poem in this bottom corner over here. That his poem will map itself onto the form of a Ouija board with 28 sections, letters A through Z, and yes and no. Merrill eventually reserves yes and no for scripts for the pageant, and his Book of Ephraim shapes itself into letters A through Z. His poem drafts include the broad conceptual design for his book, its pace, timing, themes, scenes, and characters. Section A is the apology, B the setting and first contact, C the first conversation, etc. He fusses over each with care and due consideration, both the broadly conceptual and the words. Back on this previous page, where he sketches the design for the book, it's appropriately enough where he's fussing over the words, describing his own habit of word painting. He starts up at the top here, futile stabs at it. My downfall was word painting, peekaboo, no, yes, peekaboo. Clauses unfurling for flushed limbs, scratch that. Of rosy limbs, scratch that. Flushed limbs, insert seraphic plumage and flushed limbs. While in the corner he lists rhetoric, clauses, plumage, verbs, nouns, parse. At the bottom of the page, his angelic secretariat plays with the idea of being a plutocrat, aristocrat, or proletariat. This officious sounding word, stable in its final sound, might be seeking not an exact rhyme, but an echo of the meter and sound of his exquisite, penciled in above near peekaboo. And ending up as the final word 6 lines above the secretariat. Stabs at it, exquisite secretariat. Where I sat, perhaps inserted for the same reason. A subtle percussion enters and begins to make shape and time of these scribbled lines. Every word is measured, sounded, replaced again, continually rewritten across the pages of his drafts. I suggest that the very habit of revision underlies the entire concept of the poem. Ephraim instructs some of these revisions, evidently, as he informs Merrill in the Ouija transcript I showed you before. You began in your poem with hints, a sly allusion. Now be forceful as you can. And indeed, a more combative draft of Ephraim opens, admit it, I have failed. Then reconsiders with other A words, which are penciled very faintly at the top here and then erased. Arguably, a priori, settles on admittedly. In this earlier draft, he admits outright failure rather than the more guarded error of the final copy. Perhaps the earliest version of these lines, dated in his own hand on October 26, 1972, try to find their footing in casual prose. You can see where he returns to adjust the phrasing in red and rewrite in pencil, working on his pun of being suckled by a wolf, not man, over here. And he even begins to break it into lines at the bottom of the page here. This is a poem written across the course of several years and reminiscing over ostensibly a few millennia. Even in its final state, it is a poem interested in its own revision. If you'd like to see Merrill's attention to revision in a bright, big sprawl of images, his word paintings, as it were, here's a series of pages archived in Merrill's own hand with dates, where you can see the growth of the final section of the poem from day to day. The typescript expands. The penciled-in lines are added in type the next day, revised over and over again in pencil, in pen, doodled on, making faces in the margins. These pages are dated January 1st through February 1st, 1975, with a note in brown pen of some other lines from a notebook for comparison from December 24th. The next 2 pages are dated from February 2nd, then February 4th, with the faces in the margin. February 5th, the 6th, 7th, the 8th, and 9th. He writes, revises, writes again, revises again and again. While this poem may be preoccupied with inspiration, it is hardly a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, even were it reflected in tranquility. This is a poem of rewriting and revision. Section X of the Book of Ephraim opens with the X-rays of La Tempesta, uncovering concealed figures, explaining the repainted and overpainted foreground, all of which lights up, the poem explains, as scholarship now and then does, a matter hitherto overpainted, the absence from these pages of my own mother. Forever a book about beginnings and re-beginnings, revelations and revisitings, the Book of Ephraim is a book of archive. The word archive itself is wrapped simultaneously in commencement and commandment from the word arche. And the imperative sense of commencement underlies the writing of the Book of Ephraim, discovering the terrain of words, shaping the territory of the esoteric. The archive and the digital archive, which can reach the widest public in the shortest time, are ripe for the experience of revision underlying the Book of Ephraim. Thank you.